Good evening, or good afternoon, good morning, good middle of the night, whenever you happen to be watching this. I'm going to take the lesson sort of on the 1945 to 1960 period. I'm going to break it out over several short videos, maybe 15 to 20 minutes each, rather than kind of do one long monster. Um, the purpose of this is just to add a little bit of detail about some aspects that the textbook don't cover, that the textbook doesn't cover. Better grammar. Um, so we want to add some things to that. Also, just as a sort of review of what I think is really important in terms of the politics and the economics of it all. We will not be dealing with the civil rights movement or with second wave feminism in this particular video. We cover that more in the 60s, and we kind of reach back to these periods of 45, 50 for its earliest sort of stirrings. So if you're wondering where that stuff is, that's next time. But for now, what we're really looking at is just trying to make sure that we've got our heads wrapped around this question of, how did the country get the way it was? Everyone loves to talk about the 1960s. Everyone loves to talk about Vietnam. Everyone loves to talk about the hippies and all of that stuff and the protest and social change and those kinds of things. That's great. But there are factors that lead into that I feel like if we don't have those firmly in hand, it can look like this stuff in the 60s just happened out of nowhere. And that's not the way that history really works. There's cause and effect. And very rarely do social movements just sort of spring out of nothing or really happen very, very, very quickly. These kinds of things tend to take time to develop. And so that's kind of the purpose here. So if I review a little bit from previous stuff on World War II, that's the reason for that, okay? The main issue for me when we're getting into the 1950s is to make sure that we understand, that whole golden age issue and this dealing with the way that we remember the past and sort of how that comes to be. The 1950s was a crazy time. The U.S. government cut taxes, increased government spending, and didn't have to borrow any money to do it. Had a balanced budget. That's incredible. Tax cuts, spending increases, and no debt. I mean, it's just that just boggles the mind if you're familiar at all with where our country is today in terms of debt and those kinds of things. That's what happens when you cut taxes hugely, and then you spend more. You go into tremendous debt, and we didn't in the 50s. And I think that's maybe part of why, for some people, there's this image of the 50s as such an incredible time. Not just because of the birth of rock and roll and the pop culture aspects of it, the rise of television and the rise of the car and such, but there's this general sense of well-being. This sense that, particularly if you were white and male, your taxes were low. The government was building roads and new schools and hospitals and putting money into scientific research, and there were plentiful jobs, and unemployment was low, wages were high. I mean, it just seemed great. But we need to stop for a second and point out sort of two clear-cut things. Number one, it was not that way for everybody. And when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're going to talk about sort of the underside to this, for people of color, for women and such. Like I said, we'll hit that in the 1960s section. But the other thing that we need to get sort of point to is the world has been devastated by war. World War II destroyed the industrial capacity of almost every other major nation on earth. Britain, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, Hitler's bombings, it just, crushed their factory-based capacity. Germany, the invasion of the Soviet Union from the east and the other Allied powers from the west, kind of sandwiching them in the middle, didn't do any wonders for their economy either. They also lost a tremendous number of people in the war, so they were down on labor. After the war, they were split into 4 regions, one controlled by France, one controlled by Britain, one controlled by the United States, and one controlled by the Soviet Union. So you have this sort of 4-way split, and people kind of getting in your way. And then Germany becomes a sort of central location for Cold War tensions, and this will lead to the Berlin airlift, when Stalin decides in late 47 and in 48 to cut off supplies that the Western powers are trying to bring into Berlin to keep it, split up. He wanted to control the whole thing. And so, he cut off supplies at that point and wouldn't let them through. And this massive airlift takes place and whatnot. But still, you can just see how this would lead to instability in a country, and how instability in a country is not good for their ability to manufacture goods. Germany, Britain, France, obviously. The Nazis occupied France, and then we liberated France. And I shouldn't finger quote that. We did. But we did so at a great cost. There were a lot of French factories that were destroyed. A lot of French people died. The countryside was torn up. They still hadn't recovered fully from the First World War. Then you've got the Soviet Union. They lost 20 million plus people. They lost cities, were leveled, factories torn. Again, they had huge famine problems, because farmland was torn up by the tanks and troops crossing and such. Japan, we firebombed Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the atom bomb, and we bombed a lot of other places. And while this all makes sense in wartime, you want to knock out the enemy's capacity to make war and to build the things that you make war with. It leaves them in a very bad position in peacetime. But what it did do for the United States was it left us as pretty much the only world power whose infrastructure was still intact. We still had the factories and the roads and the farms, and it was untouched. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that between 45 and say 60, the U.S. is just the global leader in every, primary manufacturing industry. We're exporting all the steel. We're building the cars and trucks and the vehicles and the planes and such. Boats. We're running this industrial economy at full speed because there's no competition. And when the competition kind of gets itself back together after the war, we'll start to see, German cars come to the States, the Volkswagen. We'll see Japanese cars come to the States, Honda, Toyota, Subaru, and when these cars come here, and I'm just using cars as an example, when they come here, they'll begin to siphon off sales. At first, not as much, because it takes a little while for the quality to catch up. But eventually the quality will surpass the U.S. quality, And so in the 1950s, it should not surprise us in such a short time after the war that we were the dominant trade partner for everybody. We were just exporting goods, and that created jobs at home for our people, and the wages could afford to be high. The benefits could be good, pensions, really good health care, all that kind of stuff. That could all be there. So those sort of 2 points. When we talk about the 1950s, we tend to talk about it as, this decade of consensus, this decade of affluence. We talk about it as a decade of consensus because I think that's how we like to try to remember it. But also because there were a lot of people in that period who were trying to emphasize that we're all like each other. This is America. We're Americans first. And we're brothers and sisters. And okay, as I've said before, we all know it's not exactly how it plays out, but it's a useful myth. And the use of the myth was in, this is us against the communists. This is us against the Soviets, against the Chinese, the North Koreans, later the Vietnamese. That this decade of consensus, which wasn't really a consensus, sure, but was there a reason why we wanted to believe that it was? And that's what I would suggest we just take a few moments and think about. It's very easy to tear down these kind of myths. It's not hard. What's harder is to understand the use of the myth in the first place. Kind of why did it come to be? What was its social function? Why, did people sort of propagate this? So give that one some thought as you're doing your reading and such. As far as a decade of affluence, again, we can talk about people who didn't do as well, but generally speaking, purchasing power increased by 30%, meaning people were able to buy more stuff. And it was on a steady upward climb almost the whole way through the decade, with a little bump in 1953, right at the end of the Korean War when soldiers came home. Unemployment, ridiculously low, like 3%, 4%. Again, with a little bump, kind of spike upwards when a bunch of soldiers came home in 53 from the war. But then it petered back out and everything was good. The economy was growing. GDP, gross domestic product, went from 200 billion to 500 billion over the course of 10 or 15 years. That is ridiculous growth. In comparison, growth today of 2 to 3% per year is considered huge. That's considered amazing. If growth was above that, say 5% or higher, we'd actually be concerned because of inflation. We would be concerned that the economy was spiraling out of control somehow. So for it to grow that quickly and that thoroughly, should make us sit back and say, okay, there's obviously something interesting going on here. And like I said, the lack of competition was a huge factor. This is also the age of advertising coming back. Advertising had kind of declined during the Depression because, you just couldn't sell stuff if people didn't have money. Remember, underconsumption, overproduction. So you can't really sell it if they don't have the money to buy it. But during this period, you're going to see people's incomes, again, their purchasing power is going to jump up by 30%. And so people are going to be able to afford to purchase goods and services and even spend money on luxuries. And so Madison Avenue makes its comeback, right? We're going to have, ads everywhere, and with television hitting during this decade. And when I say hitting, I mean very quickly TVs inundated people's homes. They had existed prior to 1950, but they weren't very common. By 1950, they're starting to become more common. By the middle of the decade and the end, they're everywhere. Everyone's watching, certain programs and such. One of my favorites to watch when we're talking about this era is The Twilight Zone. Rod Serling and whatnot, and watch the Twilight Zone. And some of the episodes are really interesting. They really help us to understand some of the stresses and some of the concerns that people had with the way that the world was changing. If you have access to Netflix, by all means, check out, I forget what episode it is. I think it's season 1, episode 3 is A Pitch for the Angels, which is a great little episode about just a salesman and how the world around him is changing and how he's struggling to sell and he feels kind of left behind and what happens and how you see that. It's really, really, really good. But the one that I always try to watch in class if we have time is called A Stop at Willoughby. And if you get a chance, check it out. It's a really good episode. If you can't get it on Netflix, I believe it's on Daily Motion. I believe you can get it there. You can't get the full thing on YouTube because of copyright issues and such. But I believe Daily Motion, you can get the whole thing. And it's definitely worth watching just to see there's so much going on in it. There's gender questions and such about what is the proper role of a man and what's the proper role of a woman. And is this main character, is he acting masculine or is he acting feminine? And what do those things mean? And his wife, the same sort of question. The changing pace of business. We're no longer in that sort of spit in a handshake kind of world where it's just, my word is fine and, we don't need a contract. It's just, fine that way. No, not in the 1950s. And really, it hadn't been that way for a long time. But there's always this, image, right? This sort of mythologizing. And the main character in this episode does a bit of that. For him, he's not mythologizing the 50s. He's mythologizing the late 19th century as this sort of glorious time, right? When everything was better and I wish I could go there. So if you get a chance, and you certainly don't have to, but if you get a chance, take a quick watch. It's like 25 minutes long. It is really good TV. They don't make them like that anymore. It reminds me a lot of, say, Black Mirror. Very sort of similar vibe to the two shows if you're not familiar with the Twilight Zone. Anyway, so the 50s, great decade and all of this. There are some issues, though. There are some issues. And like I said, we talked about race, and we're going to talk about gender. We're going to be talking about those things. Okay, fine. But there's this increasing sense of disconnectedness from the world, and I don't know how to put it better than that. Some people understand this when I say it this way, and other people just look at me. But this sort of ennui, this sense of isolation, alienation, being alone in a crowded room, that kind of feeling, And that seems to be a sort of decade-long pattern. Betty Friedan talks of that in her famous book, The Feminine Mystique. But other writers really get into it too. If you read J.D. Salinger's famous book, The Catcher in the Rye, it's all about this young man and his search for authenticity. And he doesn't like things that he says are phony. It's like his favorite word throughout the whole book. Everything is phony. And he's sick of the phony things. And he wants the real things. He wants the authentic things. And I think that was a thing that a lot of people as culture and the United States focused on, this homogeneity, on everyone being the same. There was a lot of pressure to be the same. And you and I both know that that's not the way the world works. I'm a unique special snowflake. Yes, a unique special snowflake, just like everybody else, is a unique special snowflake. But I've got my stuff that is uniquely Dave, and I can bring to the world and I can talk about. And it's why it's so much fun to have different professors over time, because you get to, learn about similar subjects through different lenses. I have a friend who, when he teaches this course, he has a completely different approach to it. And that's fine. That's him. That's what he brings. And I think he probably does a great job. I haven't seen him teach, but I'm sure he does a great job. Because he's being him and he's bringing his stuff. He couldn't teach my class my way. I can't teach my class his way. But we can be authentic to ourselves, right? And this is kind of a very modern thing that we talk about, and everyone's like, well, yeah, of course. So it's kind of revolutionary in the 1950s. Not that people didn't want to be unique or be themselves or be authentic before that, but in a decade that was focused on, we got to come together in agreement to deal with this communist threat, the idea that you were different sometimes marked you out as dangerous. And you see this, in the famous blacklists, in McCarthyism. Your book talks on that quite a bit, the sort of notion, are you a communist? Well, in 1949, the Soviet Union developed and tested its first atomic bomb, partially because Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, at least Julius for sure, Ethel maybe not, we're not 100% sure nowadays, but at least Julius, had certainly sold nuclear secrets to the Soviets. And so there was this concern that if you're not like everybody else, if you're not as good an American as everybody else, maybe you're like Julius Rosenberg, or Alger Hiss, or Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers wrote a famous book called The Witness. It's an excellent, excellent book. It's super long, so I don't sign it. It's like 700 pages. But it's his discussion of how he became a communist, joined the Communist Party, became a spy for the Soviets, and then left that, and then why he started turning people in. And it is a kind of a wrenching book because he doesn't spare anything in it. But if you're looking at these people, someone who doesn't act like you, you're a good American. But if you see someone else who's different, maybe they're not a good American like you are. Maybe they're more like the Rosenbergs or Chambers or Hiss or any of the other people, So this is a problem. This is something that I think constrains people to try to act the same, to try to be the same, be like folks, keep up with the Joneses kind of a thing. So that is a major theme in the 1950s, is this tension between being like folks and this other side of wanting to be your authentic self. The other, famous book from this period that deals with that is The Lonely Crowd by Reisman. Reisman's book here, kind of breaks people down and says, some people are controlled by the past. They're controlled by what people have written down, things like, the Bible or the Quran, or just tradition within the family. Well, everyone in my family has always lived in Lancaster County, so I would never move out of Lancaster County. Or everyone in my family is a Christian, so even if I don't really believe, I'm still going to go to church, because it's what my family does. That's tradition directed. He also identifies people who are inner directed. He says, that was America in the years right after the Revolutionary War. We were directed by these better angels of our nature by human spirit, intellect, by our own authentic selves. It's, okay, there are problems with this whole thing. But then he identifies what he calls other-directed people, and he says we're in an age of that in the 1950s. And that's, people who are directed by others' wishes and what other people, not people from the past or tradition, but present people. And the problem with this is the present always moves forward, right? Today's present will be past tomorrow. And so you have to constantly be shifting yourself, and you never stabilize as a person. You never develop your own sense of identity because you're always changing it in order to fit with what other people are doing. Reisman thinks this is dangerous. His famous quote is that, this is an age of people who would rather be loved than esteemed. You got to break that down for a second. People say, well, isn't that the same thing? Well, in Reisman's world, esteemed was respected. Loved, he's using that as kind of liked. And this is something I've said as a professor for years. I've said this as a father too. You don't always have to like me, but you have to respect me. You have to, trust that I am, doing my best, and you have to treat me decently and all that. You have to respect me. That's what I'm looking for out, in my students and in my kids and whatnot. You don't always have to like me, but you have to respect me. I would rather be esteemed than loved. I would rather you look at me, even if you don't like me, and say he's a good person. There are plenty of people who I know who I look at and say, I would not want to go out with that person and spend any time with them socially. But I respect them. I just don't enjoy their company much. And that's kind of what he's getting at here. He's saying, when you're more concerned about people liking you socially and wanting to be in your company than you are with your inner life and how successful you are at being human, it's dangerous. It's very, very, very dangerous. Your authentic self, Reisman suggests, is far more significant than anyone else's approval. Anyway, getting off of the pop psychology here. The reason why I say this book is important is because I think it really does help to hammer down and define the 1950s some. It was, I think, an other-directed time. And I think every decade can be that way. But I think we really, want to keep that in the back of our heads when we're dealing with the 1950s. So I'm going to sign off, but the last thing that I want to leave you with, in the PowerPoint, there's a slide that talks about, sort of the car culture. If you haven't already looked at that PowerPoint, don't. Stop and think and try to make a list of all the changes that took place in our country because of cars, because of the rise of cars. Think about things in the 50s. Think about, popular culture stuff, demographics, geography, political things, economic things, religious life. Think about, childhood, exercise and activities, and think about all of this different stuff, and think about, just anything you can think of, and try to make yourself a little list. There is a list in that PowerPoint. It's not everything. There's some stuff that I left off, and we went through this during class some, and it was a really good exercise. So by all means, do yourself likewise, and try to come up with some of those things, and try to think about, how something as simple as a car that we often just take for granted, how does that change society? And then realize that we can apply the same kind of thinking to a lot of other stuff. Television, the Walt Disney Company. I love doing this with Walt Disney too. Talk about the way, I mean, it's basically a corporation that owns childhood, and but there's a lot of other stuff with them that can be talked about. I love talking about these little things that people don't consider history because it's not a war or a battle or, a huge event that everyone thinks of. It's just something that really touches people's lives on a daily basis. The other thing that I would suggest you do if you get a chance is grab yourself a Dr. Seuss book. I'm not joking. A Dr. Seuss book. One of the things we'll be talking about when we talk about the 1960s is the sort of individualistic approach to things. And Dr. Seuss is emblematic of that. And if you haven't had a chance, reread The Cat in the Hat sometime. Or The Star-Bellied Sneetches, one of those like goofy childhood sort of books. They're great books. They're quick and easy to read and whatnot or whatever. If you can find one around you, just take a few minutes and pop back through that. And then if you really want to scavenger hunt, try to find yourself one of those little Dick and Jane books. They're called Dick and Jane books or Spot books. And they're kind of like Dr. Seuss from the 30s. But if you read one and then you read Dr. Seuss, I think you'll get the point of what I'm trying to get at here. Sort of the big change that is taking place. So if you get a chance for that, great. If not the end of the world. It's just one of those things that I'd like to try to suggest students do if you've got a couple of minutes, because it's kind of interesting to look at. So I'm going to sign off and be looking for a second part to this, dealing with that whole car culture question, probably tomorrow. Have a great one. Bye-bye.